Hello and welcome. My name is Ange Maloney, and I've chosen to present on research bias and how to avoid it. I've actually been wondering a lot about this particular topic as we start to think about our own research path. My current ideas for research stem from deeply personal experiences, so really very ripe for bias if I'm not careful. At its core, research bias refers to any tendency that distorts our data collection, our interpretation of data, or our reporting in a way that misrepresents the reality of what we're trying to study. It can be unintentional or systemic, and it doesn't always come from a lack of academic rigor. Sometimes it stems from our own passions. As researchers, we are encouraged, I would say, like we are instructed to care deeply about the topics that we're studying. But that care, if unexamined, can lead us to interpret data in ways that confirm our assumptions or our preferences. And this is where bias becomes a real ethical issue. Educational research doesn't happen in a vacuum. It leads to curriculum changes, shifts in pedagogy and policy. It influences how our own schools are structured and how our students are assessed and how resources can be distributed. So, the presence of bias, particularly unacknowledged bias, can have a real significant consequence for our work and the communities that we're trying to serve. The various types of biases. Confirmation bias is when we interpret data in ways that reinforce our existing beliefs. Sampling bias arises from when our participants do not reflect the diversity of the population we're studying. Measurement bias, when we using tools that favor certain outcomes or they're influenced by our cultural assumptions. And observer bias happens when our personal expectations very subtly, or not so subtly, affect how we categorize or code the responses that we're getting from our interviews and our surveys, etc. Research bias can be quite subtle, making it particularly concerning. It can infiltrate any stage of our research process, framing the question, selecting a sample, choosing a method, or interpreting our findings. So, as a consequence, entire studies may be guided in a specific direction without the researcher's awareness. So, from an ethical standpoint, this undermines some fundamental values in our research around integrity and fairness or justice. So, integrity relates to truth telling and intellectual honesty, and justice is about that fairness, ensuring that research does not marginalize or misrepresent communities. And when bias skews our findings, we fall short in our values or our intentions. Confirmation bias is a pretty common bias, or at least one that could easily find its way into our thinking if we're not aware of it. This could happen at any stage in our research, but commonly it occurs when we look at data and try to interpret it. An example in education of confirmation bias might be found in the belief of learning styles. I don't want to go too much into this kind of controversy, but for many years, many educators and researchers claimed that students learn best when taught according to their preferred style: visual, auditory, kinesthetic. Dozens of studies supported this idea, and educational programs were built around it. But a landmark meta analysis by Pashler and colleagues in 2008 found there's no evidence to support matching teaching styles to learning styles would lead to an increased learning performance or learning outcomes. So, why did this myth persist for so long? Many would argue about its confirmation bias. Researchers and educators wanted the theory to be true. It fit neatly into ideas about student centered learning, and it was easy to accept studies that affirmed what felt right. It's a powerful reminder that even well intentioned beliefs can cloud our judgment. The second example is the famous 30 million word gap. It's a study by Hart and Risley in 1995. This research claimed that by age 4, children from low income families would hear 30 million fewer words than their wealthier peers, leading to long term academic disadvantages. The study influenced early childhood education policy across the United States. It still persists today. It has been heavily criticized, especially by a group Sperry and Miller in 2018. They pointed out that Hart and Risley used a very small, mostly white, middle class sample, and they interpreted language interactions through a culturally biased lens. They overlooked the rich, diverse communication styles of many low income, non white families. So, this is a classic case of sampling bias and cultural bias. It's not just about how many families were studied, not enough. It's also about how researchers understood and valued the communication of those families. The harm wasn't just academic, it shaped how educators and policymakers perceived and treated entire companies. In that recent study, there is a gap, there is a word gap, but the studies from Sperry, and Miller in 2018 suggest that the numbers are closer to 4 million. So, what can we learn from these examples? So, first, bias often originates in the design phase. The questions we ask, the tools we choose, the samples we select, these decisions carry ethical weight. And if we're not reflective and intentional, we can reinforce inequities that we're claiming to study. Second, we must consider our own positionality. How does our identity, our own experiences, and our beliefs shape what we see? Research isn't neutral, it's relational. So that's not a flaw, this is a fact, but acknowledging it makes us better researchers. So to counteract bias, we need to build in ethical safeguards from the beginning. So, some practical ways to reduce bias in educational research, and many of these strategies are emphasized by Mertler, particularly in the context of action research. So, reflexivity. Mertler stresses that practitioner researchers need to be really self aware. So, maintaining a journal helps you document your assumptions, your role conflicts, your emotional responses as you go. It keeps your thinking really visible and accountable, and you can recognize bias as it's happening. Triangulation, so using multiple data sources or methods, surveys, interviews, and observations can provide a more comprehensive and balanced view. Mertler notes that triangulation strengthens both the validity and the credibility of your findings. You can collaborate with a critical friend through a peer debrief. Friends or external colleagues who aren't part of your immediate context, they can help surface any blind spots that are appearing. This is especially helpful for insider researchers working in their own backyard, or check out MCL's presentation for whether or not we should be researching in our own backyard. Representative sampling, you need to make sure that your participants reflect the diversity and the context that you're studying. So sampling only what's convenient or familiar can lead to skewed insights and missed voices. Our instrument design. So we get to design the ways in which we collect our data. So when developing surveys or rubrics, you need to examine your language and your framing. Are your tools culturally inclusive? Are they aligned with your research question, or are they subtly leading? Mertler encourages pilot testing all of your instruments to flag potential bias before formal data collection. And finally, a thorough literature review, right? Often overlooked, but this is a really crucial safeguarding moment against your research bias in the lit review itself. The literature, though, according to Mertler, the lit should be rigorously, ethically, and comprehensively read and reviewed. He warns that some researchers review only literature that supports the conclusion they hope to reach, which he rightly calls a biased and unethical approach. This ties directly to confirmation bias, which we've talked about before. It can start in how we frame our study or the voices we choose to include or choose to ignore. Conducting comprehensive and objective lit review helps guard against any of those issues. So taken together, all of these strategies, they won't eliminate bias, but they can help you recognize, manage, and minimize it, making your research more ethical, trustworthy, and impactful. So, in conclusion, research bias is not just a technical issue, it's an ethical one. It's not a sign of bad intentions or poor skills. It's a human tendency, and that means it requires human awareness. So, as educational researchers, our responsibility is not just to collect data, but to tell the truth, however complex, uncomfortable, or unexpected that truth may be. When we reflect critically, design thoughtfully, and remain open to surprise, we don't just reduce bias, but we honor the people we study and we strengthen the impact of our work. Thank you.